Bitterroot Valley, Idaho Territory, August 1886. The sun baked the valley floor, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. Dust rose in lazy plumes from the hooves of passing horses, settling on everything: the thirsty leaves of the cottonwoods, the rough sawn planks of the general store, and the sweat-soaked shirt of Callum Menzies. But Callum wasn't noticing the dust. He was making mud. To the men who stopped their wagons to watch, it was the most foolish thing they'd ever seen. Here, in a valley surrounded by a literal ocean of timber, a man was building a home with no logs, no frame, no stone foundation to speak of. He was on his knees in a shallow pit, mixing the valley's own clay soil with water hauled from the river and armfuls of straw from his small field. He worked with a quiet, rhythmic intensity, his boots stomping the mixture, his hands kneading it into thick, heavy loaves. "What in God's name is that Scotsman building?" a farmer named Silas Croft asked, leaning against his wagon wheel. Darnell Pickett, the owner of the valley's only sawmill, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. His livelihood was turning the endless forests into neat stacks of lumber, the very bones of civilization in this raw territory. To him, Callum's work was not just foolish, it was an insult to progress. "He calls it a house," Pickett said, his voice laced with the easy confidence of a man who knows his trade. "I call it a dirt clod waiting for a hard rain. There's no frame to it, Silas, no skeleton. First good wind that comes howling down from the pass will turn that mud pile into a puddle." The men chuckled. They had all built their own homes, wrestling heavy logs into place, their axes and saws ringing with the sound of honest work. They understood the brutal logic of an Idaho winter, the way the cold found every crack, every poorly chinked seam. A house needed strength. It needed a frame of 10-inch timbers, walls of solid pine, a roof that could hold 4 feet of snow. Callum Menzies was building a house of mud, 24 inches thick, shaping it with his bare hands as if it were pottery. It was the work of a madman. They watched him for a while longer, shaking their heads at the quiet, methodical folly of it all, before moving on, secure in their proven wisdom. What did this Scottish cob builder understand about thermal damping that a valley of experienced log builders, men who had survived a dozen brutal winters, had completely missed? Stick with us, and I promise you will learn the forgotten physics of why the oldest building material on Earth can outperform a modern wall. We'll explore the science of thermal mass, the critical difference between insulation and heat storage, and how one immigrant's quiet confidence made him a legend. By the end of this story, you'll not only understand how his house worked, you'll look at the very ground beneath your feet in a completely different way. Callum Menzies was not a carpenter. He had none of the easy familiarity with the saw and hammer that marked the other men in the valley. He was not a farmer, coaxing life from the soil with a plow and hope. He was, in his bones and in his blood, a builder of earth. His father, and his father before him, had raised walls from the damp soil of Aberdeenshire. He understood the language of clay, the temper of sand, the strength of straw. His tools were not axes and adzes, but clay spades, mixing troughs, and heavy-tined straw forks. His hands knew the feel of a proper mix, the exact moment when the earth was ready to be lifted and shaped into a wall that could stand for 1,000 years. He had come to America with his wife, Elspeth, and their 2 small children, Fergus and Isla, for the promise of land. The poster in Glasgow had shown a valley of impossible green, a place of abundance. It had not shown the winter. Their first home in the Bitterroot was a hastily built log cabin, purchased from a prospector giving up and heading west. It was built the way everyone built here: notched logs, a stone hearth, and a mixture of mud and moss for chinking. Callum had looked at it with a professional skepticism, but he was a newcomer, and this was the accepted way. He held his tongue and moved his family in. That first winter was a lesson in misery, a slow-motion disaster that nearly broke them. The card's description of their suffering was precise and brutal. The green logs of the cabin shrank as they dried in the relentlessly arid, cold air. The chinking, once packed tight, crumbled and fell away in chunks, opening dozens of tiny mouths that greedily drank the freezing wind. No matter how much wood Callum fed the fire, a bitter draft snaked across the floor, chilling their feet and stealing the warmth from their beds. Elspeth hung blankets over the walls, but they did little more than slow the icy flow of air. Worst of all was the ice. Every morning, a thick crust of it grew on the inside of the windowsills. A crystalline garden of frost that proved the cabin's heat was bleeding out into the -20-degree air as fast as the fire could produce it. Their meager supply of kindling, which was supposed to last until spring, was disappearing at a terrifying rate. Callum was up 3, sometimes 4 times a night, feeding split pine into the stove, knowing that if he let it die down, the cold would settle into the cabin like a physical presence. By dawn, the kindling box was always empty, and the family would wake shivering in their coats, their breath fogging in the air of their own home. It was a constant, exhausting battle, and they were losing. One morning, watching 5-year-old Fergus try to warm his hands over a sputtering fire, his small face pinched with cold, Callum made a vow. Never again. He would not spend another winter fighting a house that was actively trying to freeze his family. He would build a proper home. Not a log box that leaked heat like a sieve, but a house like his grandfather had built, a house made of the earth itself. The failure of the conventional log cabins in the Bitterroot Valley was not a matter of poor craftsmanship. It was a matter of physics. The men who built them were skilled and hard-working, but they were fighting a battle against thermodynamics they didn't fully understand. The problem wasn't the logs themselves. The problem was the air. A standard log cabin, even a well-built one, is fundamentally a collection of gaps. The primary enemy was air infiltration. As the logs settled and dried, the chinking between them would inevitably crack and pull away. Each tiny fissure became a siphon, pulling cold, dense outside air in and pushing warm, buoyant, inside air out. In a 20 by 20 foot cabin, the cumulative length of these seams could exceed 800 feet. Even with constant maintenance, sealing every one of these cracks against a 30-mile-per-hour wind at 20 below zero was an impossible task. Families like the Millers and the Suttons spent half their winter mixing mud and stuffing it into gaps, a losing battle against an invisible enemy. You could feel it in their homes, a constant, subtle draft that no roaring fire could ever truly defeat. The candles on their tables would flicker, not from a passing person, but from the house's own leaky breathing. The second failure was thermal bridging. Wood is a decent insulator, far better than stone or glass. But in a solid log wall, the wood itself becomes a bridge for heat to travel from the warm interior to the frozen exterior. The R value, a measure of insulating power, of a solid 10-inch pine log is only about 10. That was simply not enough to stand up to the sustained cold of an Idaho winter. Heat would conduct directly through the logs, meaning the outer surface of the wall was constantly radiating the home's precious warmth away into the night. But the most significant and least understood failure was the complete lack of thermal mass. A log cabin is a lightweight structure. It has very little capacity to store heat. When the fire was roaring, the air inside the cabin got warm. But the moment the fire died down, the air cooled almost instantly. The thin walls couldn't hold on to the heat. This is why the settlers had to burn so much wood. They were essentially trying to heat the entire Bitterroot Valley, with their cabin as a brief, inefficient stopping point for the BTUs on their way outside. Their homes were like tents made of wood. They were only warm as long as you stood right next to the fire. Callum Menzies understood this instinctively. The problem wasn't just keeping the cold out, it was about keeping the warmth in. He knew that a house shouldn't just be a barrier, it should be a battery. The construction of Callum's earthen house was a public spectacle throughout the late summer and early fall. It began not with the felling of trees, but with the digging of a pit. He chose a spot rich in clay, a vein of dense, sticky soil that the other settlers cursed when their plows hit it. For Callum, it was gold. He dug with a methodical rhythm, piling the clay near a wide, shallow basin he'd lined with timber. Day after day, he hauled water from the creek and straw from his harvest, adding them to the clay in precise, practiced ratios. Then came the mixing, a process the valley had never seen. With his trousers rolled to his knees, he would step into the pit and begin to tread the mixture, his boots squelching in the thick mud. Fergus and Isla would sometimes join him, their laughter echoing as they stomped in the muck, a game that was also the creation of their future home. He called the mixture cob. It was an ancient term, a simple word for a simple, perfect material. When the cob was the consistency of stiff bread dough, he would begin to build. There was no frame. The foundation was a simple trench filled with gravel and larger stones to keep the base of the wall dry. Upon this, he began laying the walls, one loaf of cob at a time. He would fork a heavy mass of it onto the stone base, then work it into place with his hands and a small wooden tamper, pressing and sculpting it. He built in courses or lifts, each about 2 feet high. After completing a full circuit of the house, he would stop and let the sun and wind do their work, allowing the lift to dry and harden for a week before starting the next. The walls rose slowly, organically, looking less like a construction site and more like a geological formation emerging from the earth. They were massive, a full 24 inches from inside to out. This was what truly baffled the onlookers. Darnell Pickett made a habit of stopping by every few days, his skepticism hardening into a kind of professional outrage. "Menzies," he said one afternoon, gesturing at the half-finished curving walls, "I've built dozens of structures in this territory, mills, barns, houses. They all have one thing in common, a post and beam frame. It's what holds the roof up. It's what resists the wind. What you're building here is just a pile." Callum wiped the sweat and clay from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at his wall, then back at Pickett. "The frame is the wall," he said quietly, his Scottish burr softening the words. It was his standard response, a simple statement of fact that Pickett found infuriatingly obtuse. "That's nonsense," Pickett retorted, his voice rising. "A hard wind comes down that valley, a real November gale, and that mud pile of yours will be a puddle by morning. The weight of the snow on the roof will splay these walls out like a dropped pudding. It's against all reason." Jebediah Stone, a man who prided himself on his carpentry, chimed in. "He's right, Callum. There's no shear strength, nothing to brace it against a lateral load. It's just dirt." Callum just nodded and picked up another forkful of cob. "It's strong enough," was all he said, and returned to his work. The mockery lasted through September. The validation would last for the next 100 years. He set the window frames and the heavy door directly into the cob as he built, the earthen walls flowing around them, gripping them tight. When the walls reached their full height, he laid massive hand-hewn rafters across the top, their ends resting on a timber plate embedded in the final lift of cob. The sheer weight and thickness of the walls held everything in place through gravity and friction. It was a system so simple it seemed impossible. By the first frost, the house was complete, its thick, undulating walls plastered with a final layer of smooth clay and lime. It looked ancient, soft, and utterly out of place among the sharp, angular log cabins of its neighbors. It looked, as Darnell Pickett had said, like a dirt clod. To understand why Callum Menzies' dirt clod was the warmest and most efficient home in the entire Bitterroot Valley, you have to understand a principle of physics that is far more important in home construction than simple insulation: thermal damping, the power of thermal mass. Most people think of a wall in terms of its R value. R value measures a material's resistance to heat flow. A higher R value means better insulation. A typical log cabin wall might have an R value of 10. A modern fiberglass insulated wall might be R19 or higher. By this measure, Callum's 24-inch thick wall of solid earth was not particularly impressive. Its R value was likely only around R5 or R6. So how could it possibly be warmer? The answer is that R value only tells half the story. It describes how quickly a wall loses heat, but it says nothing about how much heat a wall can store. This is where thermal mass comes in. Think of it like this. An insulated wall is like a lightweight down jacket. It's very good at trapping your body heat and slowing its escape, but the jacket itself has no warmth of its own. A high-mass wall, like Callum's cob structure, is like a massive, heavy boulder that has been sitting in the sun all day. It might not be a great insulator, but it has absorbed and stored a tremendous amount of heat energy. Long after the sun goes down, that boulder will continue to radiate warmth for hours. Callum's cabin worked like the boulder. During the day, the wood stove would be burning, heating the air inside the cabin. A standard log cabin would heat up quickly, but the walls themselves would remain cold. The heat stayed in the air, ready to escape through the first available crack. In the cob house, something different happened. The heat from the stove didn't just warm the air, it soaked into the massive 24-inch thick clay walls. A cubic foot of clay can store 30 times more heat than a cubic foot of air. With nearly 2,000 cubic feet of dense earth composing his walls, Callum had built a massive room-sized heat battery. This is the principle of thermal damping. The heat energy from the stove would be absorbed by the inner few inches of the cob wall. This process was slow and steady. Throughout the evening, as the fire in the stove was banked for the night and the outside temperature plummeted, the flow of heat would reverse. The stored energy in the walls would begin to radiate slowly and gently back into the room, keeping the air temperature stable and comfortable. The thermal wave of the day's heat, traveling through the dense clay, would take 10 to 12 hours to even reach the middle of the wall. It would never reach the outside surface before the stove was lit again the next morning, starting the cycle anew. The house acted as a giant thermal flywheel, smoothing out the extreme temperature swings between a roaring fire and a dying ember, between day and night. It didn't just block the cold, it actively managed the warmth. The other settlers were trying to win a battle of attrition against the cold. Callum had simply changed the rules of the game. The winter arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as an assault. In mid-January, a mass of Arctic air, a phenomenon the old-timers called a blue norther, descended upon the valley. For 11 straight days, the temperature never rose above zero, and at night it plunged to a soul-crushing 30 degrees below. The sky was a brilliant, merciless blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, and a thrown bucket of hot water would freeze into a cloud of ice crystals before it hit the ground. For the log cabins in the valley, it was a state of siege. Inside the Miller home, the stove was a ravenous beast, glowing cherry red around the clock. Jacob Miller and his eldest son were in a constant rotation, hauling wood from the dwindling pile outside and feeding it into the firebox. The heat was intense within 5 feet of the stove, but in the corners of the room, water buckets were frozen solid. They were burning through a week's worth of wood every 2 days. At the Sutton place, the situation was grimmer. Their chinking had failed again, and a relentless wind whistled through the northern wall. Martha Sutton had stuffed the gaps with rags and even pages from their Bible. But the cold still found its way in. Their youngest child had a deep, rattling cough, and the family huddled together under a mountain of quilts, sleeping in shifts to keep the fire from going out. The very wood of their cabins groaned and popped in the extreme cold, shrinking and opening new pathways for the enemy to enter. Inside Callum Menzies' earthen home, the world was different. There was no whistling wind. The sheer mass of the walls deadened all sound, creating a profound and peaceful silence. The air was still. The single stove burned not with a desperate roar, but with a low, steady flame. Callum would load it with dense, slow-burning logs in the morning, and again before bed. That was all. The heat it produced wasn't fierce or concentrated. It was a pervasive, ambient warmth that filled the entire space evenly. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The proof of the home's success was found in the small details of domestic life, the normalcy that the brutal cold outside made impossible elsewhere. Elspeth sat in a chair near the window, the spot that would be the coldest in any other cabin, mending a tear in Fergus's trousers. Her fingers were nimble and sure, not stiff and blue with cold. On the small kitchen table, a dish of butter was soft and spreadable. In every other house in the valley, butter was a frozen rock that had to be chipped at with a knife and thawed by the fire. Here it was simply butter. The children, Fergus and Isla, were not huddled by the stove. They were playing on a rug in the middle of the floor, dressed in simple woolen shirts, not their heavy outdoor coats. The ice that plagued the windowsills of their neighbors was entirely absent. The glass was cold to the touch but clear. The house was not fighting the winter. It was simply ignoring it. It was a small island of temperate, quiet life in an ocean of lethal cold. On the 9th day of the cold snap, the temperature at noon was a bitter 22 degrees below zero. Darnell Pickett was pushing his team and sled hard, trying to get a load of emergency firewood to the Suttons before dark. The cold was punishing. The iron on the sled was brittle, and the runners screeched on the dry, packed snow. As he passed the strange, rounded cabin belonging to the Scotsman, he heard a sharp crack, like a rifle shot. The sled lurched violently to one side, throwing him into a snowdrift. The forward runner on the right side had snapped clean in two. He swore, his breath instantly freezing into a white cloud before his face. He was a mile from his own home, and a quarter-mile from the Suttons. The horses stood with their heads low, their coats white with frost. Pickett's fingers were already aching with cold inside his thick mittens. He was a practical man. He was closer to the Menzies place. He would ask for help, or at least a place to warm himself before tackling the repair. He hated the thought of it, of admitting he needed anything from the fool with the mud house. But the cold was a powerful persuader. Stiffly, he walked the 50 yards to the cabin. It sat in the snow like a loaf of bread, smoke, curling lazily from its single chimney. There were no sounds from within. As he approached, he stumbled on an icy patch, throwing out a hand to steady himself against the wall. And then the world shifted. His brain, conditioned by a lifetime of experience, had prepared his senses for a specific feeling, the biting, energy-sucking cold of a frozen surface, the same feeling as touching stone or ice. He expected a shock of cold that would numb his hand even through his glove. What he felt was nothing. No, not nothing. It was something else entirely. It was a complete absence of cold. Curious, he pulled off his right mitten with his teeth, his fingers clumsy and stiff. He pressed his bare palm flat against the rough, lime-plastered surface of the wall. It was warm. It was not hot, like a stove. It was not even as warm as his own skin. But in a world that was 22 degrees below zero, a world where every exposed surface was a weapon of the cold. This wall was undeniably, miraculously, impossibly warm. He pressed his cheek against it. The same gentle, stored energy met his skin. It felt alive. For a full minute, Darnell Pickett, sawmill owner, expert builder, and the valley's foremost skeptic, stood with his hand pressed against the mud wall, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him. The wind howled around him, but the wall held a quiet secret of summer. Finally, he walked to the heavy plank door and knocked. Callum Menzies opened it. A wave of stable, gentle warmth washed over Pickett, carrying the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove, but the deep, comfortable warmth of a mild autumn day. He saw Elspeth by the hearth. He saw the children on the floor, and he understood. He looked from Callum's calm face to the thick, curving wall beside the door. His own cabin, built of the finest, tightest-fitting pine from his own mill, felt like a windy barn compared to this. The professional arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a profound and unsettling awe. "Menzies," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your sled?" Callum began. Pickett shook his head, waving off the question. He pointed a thick, gloved finger at the wall he had just touched. What is this?" he asked, his voice full of a genuine confusion he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He was not asking about the material. He was asking about the magic. Callum looked at the wall his hands had built, then back at the man who had mocked it. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply stated the principle. It holds the heat. Pickett stared at the interior of the wall, seeing it now not as a crude barrier, but as a reservoir of energy. The reddish glow of the stove seemed to be soaking into the very earth it was made from. He reached out and laid his hand on the inside surface. It was even warmer, a solid, comforting presence. He finally understood. "You didn't build a wall," Pickett said, his voice quiet with revelation. "You built a hearth." The conversion of Darnell Pickett was as sudden and total as a flash flood. He spent an hour in Callum's home, drinking hot tea and letting the gentle warmth seep into his bones. He asked questions, not with the tone of a critic, but with the humble curiosity of a student. By the time Callum had helped him mend his sled runner, Pickett was a believer. And when Darnell Pickett believed in something, the whole valley knew about it. He didn't just stop mocking the cob house, he became its most vocal advocate. He described the feeling of that warm wall to anyone who would listen at the general store, his words carrying the weight of his reputation as a master builder. "It's not like anything you've ever felt," he'd explain. "The cold just stops. It doesn't get in." But the idea truly took root and spread through the unlikeliest of channels. The Sunday sermon. Reverend Michael Blackwood was a thoughtful man, one who saw parables in the turning of the seasons and the struggles of his flock. He had heard the stories of the Menzies cabin, first as a joke, and then, after the cold snap, as a whispered wonder. He saw a deeper lesson in it. The following Sunday, he stood before his congregation, which included the Millers, the Suttons, and a newly humbled Darnell Pickett. "We are a proud people," the Reverend began. "We take the mightiest trees from God's forest. We shape them with our strength and our saws, and we build homes to shelter us from the storm. We believe strength lies in the rigid heart of the oak, in the straight grain of the pine. And yet," he paused, his eyes finding Callum and his family in their pew, "the Lord has shown us another kind of strength. Our brother Menzies did not hew the mighty tree. He took the humble earth God gave us, the clay beneath our very feet, the dirt we curse when it clings to our boots, and he built a home. And that home held the warmth through the great cold, not with the strength of defiance, but with the strength of embrace. It teaches us that true wisdom is sometimes found not in conquering nature, but in listening to it. That sermon transformed Callum's strange house from a private curiosity into a piece of community legend. The story was no longer about a stubborn Scotsman. It was a lesson in humility and divine wisdom. By the time the spring thaw arrived, the practical implications had sunk in. 3 families, including the Suttons, approached Callum not with skepticism, but with a request for guidance. They had seen the proof. They wanted to learn. That summer, the rhythmic stomping of boots in wet clay could be heard in other parts of the valley, a new sound of survival taking root in the Idaho soil. The frontier innovation of Callum Menzies, born of ancient Scottish tradition and forged in a brutal Idaho winter, was a remarkable preview of building science principles that wouldn't be fully understood and articulated for another century. His 24-inch cob walls were a masterful, intuitive application of what modern architects and engineers call a mass wall system. Today, designers of high-performance, energy-efficient buildings use sophisticated software to model the effects of thermal mass, calculating how thick concrete floors or masonry walls can absorb solar heat during the day and release it at night to reduce heating and cooling loads. They speak of thermal lag and phase shift, technical terms for the same phenomenon Callum understood in his bones, the time it takes for a heat wave to travel through a dense material. His house, with its 12-hour thermal lag, was a perfectly tuned passive solar structure, even without large south-facing windows. He had created, out of dirt and straw, a building that anticipated the core tenets of sustainable design and green architecture by 100 years. There is a profound and simple truth captured in the quiet performance of that earthen house. A log cabin fights the cold. It stands against the wind and the frost as a brittle, rigid barrier, a fortress under constant siege. A stone house resists it, its cold, dense nature a stubborn refusal to yield. But the cob house did neither. It made a covenant with the heat. It absorbed the energy of the fire, not greedily, but gently, taking it deep into its own substance. It held that warmth, protecting it from the ravenous cold outside. And then, as the fire slept, the walls gave that warmth back, breathing it slowly into the room, a long, gentle exhalation that lasted until the dawn. The other houses in the valley were built of dead things, trees cut down and stripped of their life. Their warmth was fleeting, lasting only as long as the flame that made it. But Callum's house was made of the living earth, and it seemed to possess a kind of memory. It was as if the clay itself, born of ancient geology and time, remembered the heat of its own formation. The structure was more than a shelter. It was a participant in the family's life, a silent partner in their survival. Earth remembers every fire it held. It keeps a portion of the warmth, a faint echo of every flame, storing it away for the time when it is needed most. It is a lesson in resilience, a quiet testament to the enduring power of working with the world, instead of merely living upon it. Thank you for joining us for this journey back to the Bitterroot Valley. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of frontier survival and the science behind them. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen a cob or other earthen home? What forgotten technologies from the past do you think deserve to be rediscovered? Disclaimer. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building methods in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.